gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And here we are again, connected to start one more session again for this process that we started in February. And as always, we thank life for this opportunity. And we are going to ask our sister from the region of Asia to please open this session for us, as we have always done, asking for permission to our grandmothers and grandfathers and those superior beings. Thank you. Welcome, sister. Please go ahead.
Invitamos a la hermana representante de la región de Asia.
We're inviting our sister from Asia, who is going to do the opening for us today, to please go ahead and do that. Can our sister hear us?
Aprovechando este espacio, pues vamos a pedir,
So we are going to thank, to give thanks for this day, because there are many opportunities to give thanks. And one of us who is here connected already can please take this responsibility to give thanks for this day. And if so, please go ahead. We're inviting a volunteer to please go ahead and open up the day, because we know how to do this. It does not matter in what way you do it. What matters is the feeling that we're going to give our words and our reflection today.
Vamos a seguir invitando a una de nuestras participantes.
So we continue to invite a volunteer, please. Is there a volunteer, please?
I can volunteer. This is Siobhan.
Gracias, Siobhan. Gracias, muy amable. Vamos. Gracias. Ahí le dejamos el tiempo.
Okay. So I just want to say thank you, Gualatan Gualu, which is ancestors in my language. We're thankful for today and this opportunity to gather with all of these incredible women from around the world. We're so thankful for the work of our ancestors and generations before us, and everyone who has struggled for our rights so that we can all be here. We're thankful for elders who took care of our lands and passed down the honor of defending our lands and fighting for our rights. We know and we hope that all of our work will not be in vain. We're thankful for all of the time that people are taking out of their weeks to come and to show up and to learn. And I pray that today will be a good learning session, and that we'll remain thankful for the collective work of everyone, and that all of our different communities that will continue to do good work. Thank you.
Gracias, Siobhan. La verdad es de que también me uno a
Thank you, Siobhan. I joined you in this gratitude and desire that we have a clear, flat, straight paths for the work that we are doing, each one of us is doing. So with further ado, we now give a warm welcome again to Professor Elsa, who has been joining us every Friday throughout this process. It's an incredible wealth and richness that she brings to us. And it's a terrific opportunity, and why not? An amazing blessing to have her with us as part of our story. She is going to talk to us again about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially the Pillar 2 about lands, territories, and resources. And later on, she will also talk to us about cultural rights. So please take notes. And any questions that you may have, write them all down, because they will give us an opportunity to engage in a dialogue. And sometimes it's uncomfortable if nobody has any questions or comments, because it seems like everything was understood and everything, and there are no questions about anything. But we invite you to actively participate in this conversation. Now we give the floor to our sister, Professor Elsa. Welcome again, and thank you for being with us. And let's continue walking firmly, giving firm steps forward towards a new way of life that we seek, a new way of defending our rights. Welcome, Sister Professor Elsa. I give you the floor now for the next minutes that we'll have. We want to take advantage of your wealth of knowledge. So please go ahead. Thank you so much, dear Elsa. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you.
Good afternoon, good evening, dear sisters. I am very happy to be with you and to share, because every time I learn from you, I get inspired by you, because you are there doing the work and having the experiences, that actually have built this movement and are building also our visions for the future and Indigenous people's visions for the future. So, and I wanted to thank Hortensia for organizing our minds together this morning, but also I wanted to say that thank you to Shaban for her inspiring words, for linking us to ancestors, mentioning the land as well, which happens to be one of our big topics of the day. So thank you, dear sisters. And we have a lot of material to go through. I will try to go slowly so that we clarify in our minds. Please also, as Hortensia said, if you have any questions, just note them, so when we pause, we are able to enter into a dialogue. I see that my FIMI friends have allowed me to share screen, so I will do that. I will start by sharing my PowerPoint. Oh, okay, FIMI did it. Okay, thank you very much, dear FIMI. No, I can do it. I can do it because I can move it then according to my pace, if it's okay with you, my friends. Okay, let me just share. Okay. So here we are. Okay, so you remember when we, no, from our schedule, you see the words Pillar 1, right to self-determination. Pillar 2, right to lands, territories, and resources. Pillar 3, cultural rights. These are three pillars of the Declaration. And if you read the Declaration diagonally, any way you like, you see how interlinked they are, because life is interlinked, And so it's not that you will find a chapter title in the Declaration, land rights, and have all the land rights, or self-determination and have everything. but you read it critically and you can see all the links. And the same with land rights, it is there everywhere. So the issues that we see today, what are the issues, meaning the problems, and that's why indigenous peoples wanted very much to establish land rights as a fundamental pillar of the declaration, because they have faced many issues. Land grabbing by companies, by states, by settlers, and their displacement, of course, that goes with that. Non-recognition of collective land rights is very common in several countries. Mega projects, pollution, monocropping, ethanol cultivations, cultivations of plants so that they provide energy, for rich countries, by the way. Parks, nature conservation areas, big issue. We have at the moment almost 15% of the earth as nature parks, and another 15 is being prepared so that by 2030 we're going to have, that's the idea, 30%. But what does this mean for indigenous peoples? Also, we find prohibition of subsistence activities, simple subsistence activities, like, for example, fishing salmon in Alaska, or fishing in eastern Siberia for indigenous peoples. Not allowed. It's allowed for commercial purposes and for fun, but not when the indigenous people want it for subsistence. Then you have the problem of toxic dumping, including nuclear dumping, of course. You have militarization and other issues, militarization of indigenous lands. And I am sure, and I would like, if you don't mind, to think what are, from indigenous women's perspectives, also some of the land-related problems, because that is also important to underline. Of course, we know militarization is, all these affect indigenous women, but maybe you want to highlight some of the issues, that are related to land that affect indigenous women. So today, the main approach in our days, the main approach to the land rights and rights to land, territories, and resources is through property rights. But land rights are understood under the angle of the right to equality and non-discrimination. Okay, so this is now the basis through which we will go in and go deep to understand these concepts of equality and non-discrimination, which are, of course, fundamental human rights and generally constitutional rights concepts. So in Article 2 of the Declaration, we read that indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal, the word equal, to all other peoples and individuals, and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that based on their indigenous origin or identity. The non-discrimination principle is so fundamental that you see it in all the treaties of human rights treaties. It's fundamental, and it's there, and it's, of course, in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the question that we ask here is whether, what is the understanding of equality? And as much as it's basic and it's a pillar, right, in almost all constitutions and human rights treaties, at the same time, it's a complex concept, equality. So the conventional, the standard understanding of equality is that we treat equal cases equally. Okay, let's take an example. All children, indigenous and non-indigenous, in the United States of America have the right to be educated in the English language. What about true equality and non-discrimination in practice? Does this mean what I read, all children, indigenous and non-indigenous in the USA, have the right to be educated in the English language? Does it reflect true equality? So what happens in our societies and in our political systems is that if the state takes no action and is passive, the state implicitly favors majority culture, or the wishes of the majority, if I can put it this way, especially cultural. So laws, policies, and budgets normally are based on values and interests of the majority culture. For example, decisions on language and education, they favor the majority culture. So the state often does not explicitly discriminate, but implicitly promotes one single national identity. And we like to show this picture, equality versus justice, or the concept of equality. What does it mean? Here you see these children of different sizes, right? Different ages and sizes, with the same stool to step on to see football. But that's equality because they have the same, equal stools. But real justice, equality in terms of fundamental and meaningful and real, that's the word, real equality, which means social justice, would mean what you see on the second picture, that you create, different steps for the different sizes of children so they can watch football. So, and equality does not mean sameness. By now, in the human rights theory and doctrine and practice, on the part of the numerous UN human rights mechanisms, and of course in academic writings, equality does not mean sameness. Instead, it means we create the conditions that will allow for people to express freely their differences, including their differences that are based on ethnic, religious, cultural, and other identity. And inclusion, the word inclusion, right? We include people, is just one aspect of equality. Yes, inclusion is positive. It's one aspect of equality. But what needs to be done are specific steps, concrete steps, conscious steps on the part of the state in order to address the specificities of groups and individuals in those groups that face particular issues based, in the case of indigenous peoples, also on historic injustices that they have been affected by, that have been imposed on them. And we say here that it is very important, through our social struggles of many years, through our human rights culture that people actually in the streets and through their struggles have created, it is very important to disentangle the state with one specific ethnic or other identity, because in each state there are tremendous varieties of groups of different identities. So there are various human rights bodies, my friends, human rights treaty bodies that have pronounced themselves on these issues of equality and of indigenous peoples in various ways. One is the Human Rights Committee, which is the monitoring body under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Second, it's the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights under the relevant Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They produced number 20. And CERD is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in their comment number 32. So a lot of work and thinking has been done over the years about what this all means. So when we come specifically to Indigenous peoples' land rights, we need to reverse the classical international law concept of the doctrine of discovery and of terra nullius. By the way, my friends, I don't know if you had the chance to see the big piece of news from yesterday that thanks to the many and for years efforts of Indigenous leaders, finally yesterday, and Indigenous leaders have been this week in the Vatican repudiated the doctrine of discovery. This is huge news. It came to my computer, through the networks yesterday evening. I would like to, and I think all of us should look into this declaration that was made by the Vatican, so that we, comment on it, we post things about the significance of this moment. So coming back to our, land rights issue, so it's very important to reverse the doctrine of discovery and to reverse this concept of terra nullius, empty land. So the doctrine of discovery gave the discovering, in quotation marks, nation, state, particular rights under international law vis-a-vis other colonizing nations. In other words, if Spain went into a land, in the American continent before Portugal, then Spain would have the right to colonize it. What a concept. But the doctrine of discovery gave no legal right. That's important because, we forget it sometimes because we get kind of very mad and sometimes desperate and really mad, indignant. So the doctrine of discovery gave the discovery nation no legal right against the native nations, against the indigenous peoples. Although this was interpreted like that by the colonizers. We just have to say, for the significance of law, when it is on our side, let's say it, that it is on our side. So what the colonizers did, they deformed, also the concepts of those days, and they said, hey, it means we can take it away, because we so want, from the indigenous peoples. So discovery did not give the discovering country any ownership of native lands. It only gave the discovering country exclusive right to buy the land from the native owners if they wanted. So legally speaking, that was that. That's not what happened. They went into, as colonizers, into a very aggressive mode. So the non-discrimination and land issue comes to, among other things, to the issue, of who are the people from whom land is taken away. So the CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, said that what is needed is formal recognition by the state of land rights. And we must reject the terra nullius, the empty land concept, and similar doctrines. And that true equality prompts us to move beyond just common conventional notions of property when it comes to indigenous peoples and land rights. This is a very big, let me add the word revolutionary concept, because I remember, my friends, I was there in 82, 83, when indigenous peoples at the beginning of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations were, explaining the concept of communal ownership of land. You could see the faces of the diplomats. It was something between disbelief. They couldn't believe it, what they were hearing. And they couldn't understand it either, because in the conventional legal / political concepts of land rights, property rights, it's an individual right, not a group right. So there is a concept very important on mainstream property rights theory, that in order to confirm, to claim right to a land, you have to have intense, continued, and exclusive use of the land, they say. So we now dialogue with this concept, and we say, well, pluriculturality demands recognition of legal pluralism. Actually, there are different systems of land tenure in the world, and indigenous peoples have different land tenure systems that need to be recognized, seen and recognized. There are also very good, I wanted to add, and I put them here in this PowerPoint, which Fimi will share with you. There are important international court decisions that confirm what we are saying about indigenous people's rights and land rights, and which are captured in the declaration. So the first important case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was the Aguas Tigni versus Nicaragua case. This was a case where indigenous peoples won on many points in that decision, but also won on the issue of reconfirmation of land rights, collective land rights. And other decisions that I mentioned here, the Marie and Dan sisters, Carrie Dan versus United States, that was also Inter-American Court of Human Rights, a big victory of the Dan sisters. The Saramaka people versus Suriname, Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Endorois people versus Kenya, African Commission on Human Rights. And the Ogiek versus Kenya is the first African Court of Human and People's Rights that gave a positive decision for the land rights of the Ogiek people. And finally, not finally, we have several. It's a positive thing for indigenous rights. We have the Saho-Yamaksha versus Paraguay in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where it says that traditional possession of the lands by indigenous peoples has equivalent effect as state-granted full title. This is exactly a recognition by the court of the pluriculturality of the law. So yes, indigenous peoples also have, according to their systems, they have systems of land rights. They have had always, because land was always a precious thing in the world. And so the court here says traditional possession. It doesn't have to have, a stamp by the new state, because traditional possession can go before the creation, for example, of certain states, right? It can be centuries ago. It is equivalent, the court says, as state-granted full title. And it says also traditional possession entitles indigenous peoples to official property right title. So it says, hey, once the state sees, we all see that there is traditional possession according to their traditional laws, customs, and ways of life, then the state has a paper that says that. So the rights, the articles in the declaration that deal with land rights are 10, 25, 26, 27, 28. We'll go through them. So Oops, sorry for that. So the first, indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. It's what captures what the analysis that I was just referring to. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. Again, same concept. States shall give legal recognition, here it is again, and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. I so much appreciate this language, that of course indigenous leaders pushed into the declaration and that it was accepted, because you see here that the declaration really confirms legal pluralism, that there are various legal systems and traditional systems are also part of legal systems, that exist. And by the way, there are other legal systems that are traditional, but are not of indigenous peoples. In other words, there is nothing exotic or exceptional. I demystify this by saying nothing exotic nor exceptional about the need to recognize traditional systems, legal systems, because they exist at many levels and by many groups, not necessarily indigenous peoples. Then we see that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal areas. And what is very important here is that the declaration confirms that indigenous peoples' relation to the land is not just material. Of course, it is also material, because one needs to use land, for subsistence and for survival and for development, for well-being, but it's also spiritual. And by the way, the UN system, thanks to indigenous leadership again, has recognized that there are land-based religions that indigenous peoples have in many parts of the world. Then, of course, this is an article that is very strong and saying that indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands of territory or territories. This is such a fundamental concept of indigenous rights. It is, the big no-no, the biggest prohibition is that people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. You see here, my friends, the free, prior, informed consent, which is the strictest requirement that is imposed by the declaration on the most fundamental rights, that in order for the state or anybody for the state to intervene and do anything regarding certain things, certain rights, free, prior, and informed consent is required. And of course, this is one of the areas of forcible, the removal of people from the indigenous peoples from their lands. Then in Article 27, it says that states shall establish and implement in conjunction with indigenous peoples concerned fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process, giving due recognition to indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, to recognize land rights and to adjudicate, if there are differences, these rights, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. Indigenous people shall have the right to participate in this process. In other words, a state where due process of law is considered to be present must create processes to adjudicate, first of all, to recognize land rights of indigenous peoples and to adjudicate differences, disagreements that may exist. And here we say that, again, similar to the previous article, indigenous peoples have the right to redress. So redress, first you create the processes to adjudicate, but then you redress by means that can include restitution, or when it's possible, just fair and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. In other words, redress, right? And in case their free, prior, and informed consent had not been sought. So you see again the strictness of the declaration regarding land rights. And it says, unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, and legal status, or monetary compensation, or other appropriate redress. So, going back to our very good human rights treaty bodies, CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, also said that states must implement in good faith the right to free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to indigenous peoples, when it has to do with lands, okay? And the right to say no to parties seeking access to their land. Otherwise, it's discrimination. If you don't respect that right, it's discrimination, says the Committee Against Racial Discrimination. And the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights embraces a right of indigenous community to deny access to natural resources that are situated on their traditional territory. You see, in other words, a unanimity, my friends, to this idea of indigenous peoples having been fundamental in saying no, and controlling what is happening on their lands. This is a unanimity among, not just in our declaration, but also among the theory that is created and the pronouncements of human rights bodies. Similar concept comes out of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Extractive activities should not take place within the territories of indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. So we come now to the big question that is in everybody's mind, knowing the realities that often, affect so negatively our lives, indigenous lives. Expropriation of lands. Okay, what are the requirements for expropriation of lands in common democratic law of countries? So that expropriation has to be under conditions that are prescribed by law. So you have to find it in the law. What are the conditions that you can expropriate land? Okay, you can say that it's normally unproblematic. That, okay, that can also apply, let us say, can be applicable to indigenous peoples, just this one, but there are others. Okay, the second condition of expropriation that you find in common laws, legitimate aid. Well, there has to be a legitimate aim. We need to build a school, we need to build a road, or the clinic, health clinic, something. Okay. Normally, you can say that in non-indigenous contexts, it's something that you find that is pronounced, it's declared. What is the legitimacy of this work that we need to do, for which, Mr. So, we need to take your land? And the third condition is proportionality. In other words, what harm do I do to the person whose land I'm taking by comparison to what I will provide to the common good, to the legitimate aim that I have claimed? Okay, let's look at what it means. I create the concept just for the, the value of discussion here, of the well-meaning state. Suppose you have a well-meaning state that may claim that natural resource extraction fulfills the legitimate aim criterion. Large-scale resource extraction may meet that criterion. Okay, I need to, to dig for a lot of iron or whatever. So if the legitimate aim is present, the question then is, in non-Indigenous contexts, whether the infringement to the property of the person, right, the land that you will take, is proportionate. It normally boils down to whether you give the full market value of the land as compensation to Mr. Smith, Mr. Gonzalez, whoever. And the question is, does the market value formula work in an Indigenous context? Let's suppose the state says, okay, I'll give you the market value, Indigenous nation. And so the answer here is that Indigenous peoples do not value their lands primarily, if at all, in monetary terms. Indigenous peoples normally will not have access to alternate equivalent lands. They will not give them, alternate equivalent lands. And large-scale resource extraction normally fails to meet the proportionality criterion, because normally what happens, if you have the large-scale resource extraction creates such devastation to nature, to the lands, and therefore to the Indigenous peoples, that it's really incredibly destructive. If we have many examples of that. And conclusion, there is little room to expropriate Indigenous territories. This wonderful analysis, which I borrow here, is done by Matthias Aren, a Sami jurist and Indigenous leader. So the challenge is, and I finish with this, is what do we do if there are conflicts? What happens if there are conflicts between an Indigenous nation that has traditional land rights to a certain land and an individual that has also a piece of paper that says, hey, I own part of this land? How do we implement the declarations, wonderful parameters, and recognition of land rights? And what are some legitimate conflicts that can arise, assuming we have a well-meaning state that wants to feed all its people? Can the state say, hey, I'm a poor country and I need to feed everybody, so we need to give mining rights or logging rights to these corporations so that we can get some income and feed the people? And how can the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples help us in resolving issues? And I say here at the very end, and I will stop here and discuss with you, the Declaration guides us, I feel, to peaceful solutions. It starts from recognizing the rights to lands, territories, and resources. First comes the recognition. Then it gives a methodology of dealing with the conflicts. Indigenous peoples, it says, must be consulted. they have to be represented by their own representative authorities. Free, prior, and informed consent is required. Redress must be provided. There cannot be forced relocation, and so on. So I will pause here because I find that we need to stress and use the declaration in a constructive way for solutions, not just for solutions, not just because of just presenting our aspirations, but in terms of sitting at the table and discussing, the specificities of our issues and the modalities, the mechanisms, how we can solve them. The indigenous leaders that participated in this intensive exercise of the drafting of the declaration, thought of the various steps and put them in there, So I feel that with this last, reflection, we have a kind of opening, of paths that we can use. So I would like to stop sharing and come back to us, to our group, and ask you, my friends, if you would like to make a statement, to a question, to dialogue with each other, for that matter, on this huge issue of the right to lands, territories, and resources. So the floor, the room is open for everybody to speak.
Hi, Professor Elsa. I have a question. So my name is Shaban. I'm from Guam. And so throughout this whole process with the global school, with every lecture that we learn more about the different mechanisms within the UN to advocate for our rights, specifically land rights, like you were talking about today. I keep coming back to this, trying to look for help specifically for the 17 non-self-governing territories. And currently looking at Guam's history, sometimes I feel like it almost feels like we put all of our effort currently as an island into self-determination. And right now, when Guam, if you look at the history of Guam at the UN, we have to focus all of our energy on self-determination because we don't have an independent seat at the UN. And with the United States being our administering power, sometimes the mechanisms that are available to other independent nations to enact these kinds of recommendations, they sometimes feel a little bit inaccessible for the non-self-governing territories. And like recently, Guam, they presented a joint allegation letter at the UN that was signed by a bunch of the special rapporteurs. And the US, just being so powerful, they were able to kind of receive it, and our issues are on the international stage, but the US kind of just dismissed it. And I guess in my mind, where do you see the non-self-governing territories? What mechanisms in your experience do you feel like, if you have any comments on this, what do you feel like has been really helpful for people from territories that are not yet independent and do not have, I guess, that same presence and that same ability this because it's really interesting to be some of the last in the whole world that hasn't gained their independence. And sometimes I look at the other territories and I wonder how it's possible for us to advocate for our independent land rights when we remain kind of colonies. But yeah.
Ban, what an amazing question, and thank you for the background. And I'm so happy, that sisters from Guam joined the FIMI groups, and because you provide a perspective that is special from Guam, and what you were saying about militarization. But let me start by referring to the non-self-governing territory status, and to say that these processes on non-self-governing territories, like the decolonization processes, right, formally at the UN, I will tell you for sure, are today some of the most conservative, stiff processes. You can hardly touch them, pierce. When I was chief of the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, we had even a mandate from the Permanent Forum. They had asked us to do something. They wanted the connection with the Committee on Decolonization. And even my colleagues who are staff members, like me, I was staff member, UN staff, they felt they could not even relate to me. They were so afraid. So, in other words, it is a very stiff environment politically. And it is an environment in which not many changes happen.
Mm.
Okay, so in that sense, I have admired from afar. But since you are asking me now, I'm going to say it to our group in a seminar context, in our room here. That I think it's very courageous. It's too high an aim. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You should be doing it, but it's not the only one. And now I come to the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Because first of all, to be a state, of course, in your case, because you're also an island territory, yes, I understand, and I know your struggles, and I had a wonderful alumna, from FIMI as my student at Columbia. I was very happy. But there are many other things you can do.
Mm-hmm.
All the other things that are available to indigenous peoples through the human rights system are available to you. So if you want to raise land rights and the militarization that you are facing, because you are, it's terrible. You can, of course, be present yourself at the indigenous related mechanisms meetings, the Permanent Forum on these issues, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And you can speak and create visibility. You can create side events with high visibility. You can bring amazing people to be speakers. And you can use the human rights complaints procedures. They are there for you to use them. I mean, the reason also that is interesting for you to see, for example, CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, is to know that this committee is so open, so indigenous friendly at this point. They are friends. The Human Rights Committee under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, friends. Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, friends of the indigenous. Of course, the US, since you are supposedly US citizens, right, has not ratified all these human rights treaties, but it has ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So you can submit information to the Human Rights Committee. Plus, Shoban, you have more than 40 special rapporteurs, human rights special rapporteurs today, on One of them is the one on indigenous peoples, but this one is not the only one you can address. You can address according to the topic you want to follow. For example, you have violence against women, trafficking, toxic dumping. It's relevant. You are going to analyze what theme is important for you and submit those complaints. Actually, later on in this series of seminars, I'm going to give you this little seminar I give. I call it Demystifying the Complaints Procedures. This is a seminar that is meant for that. And another thing, you say the US is strong. Of course it's strong, but it doesn't mean that it does not record and it does not get bothered by, and it might not do one thing. Maybe you ask for 10 things in your letter, but it might do one or two, meaning this is what the social struggle and the human rights and the indigenous struggle is long term, and you have to, and I have seen that people who have organizations, right, who have systematically submitted, a narrative of complaint to these various mechanisms, they have reached a certain profile internationally, with difficult countries. US is not the only difficult country, because especially, human rights, they bother countries. Well, that's good that they bother. Why do they bother? Because it shows that there is something in the moral language that matters in the conscience, So we have to use them, because all these procedures that I just mentioned now, and in our next seminar, I'm going to give you all this in writing. It is people who created them, Shaban. Who do you think created them? States just accepted because they felt embarrassed to say no. I don't want, a mechanism on enforced disappearances. They feel, embarrassed to vote no. So it is people's struggles, I'm saying. So these mechanisms are ours, yours and mine to use. That's what I want to say, And so it's meaningful you don't have to be a state to do all that. Because you say, we are not a state, look at the others that are states. Well, most indigenous peoples are not states, as you know.
Yeah.
And they don't ask to be states, actually. Even your case is particular. You have a certain historical, etc., with the wars, with what happened to you, So, but it is a very good question. And so you have accessibility, Shaban, to use your word. You have accessibility to the procedures. Okay? That's why we are talking about this it's a human rights program. Yes, that's accessible to you. Good. It's good because people made it, social struggles made it.
Yeah.
Did
I want to say thank you just for highlighting that, because I think growing up in Guam and doing a lot of the being active in the community organizing arena in Guam, I think because visually and politically there was a lot of focus on self-determination in the past. I think a lot of those other mechanisms that you just mentioned haven't been as brought to the forefront. And I guess I'm thankful for programs like FEME that can kind of help us think outside of the conventional channels that we've been trying to force our people down, when there's like a whole world of other strategies and movements and ways to access these tools that you're talking about. So thank you. That was really I feel encouraged.
I'm glad, Shaban. I didn't just say to encourage you, Shaban, because I am sure you're very encouraged. But it's also, the intergenerational aspect of the social struggles. Each generation of leaders, might focus on some, might create these 3 goals. Okay. And then next generation might come and create, okay, these additional, I mean, that's history. We walk through history. So it doesn't mean that our forefathers did not do good things. They did good things, but based on also new, because things develop internationally also, right? So there are new things that exist now that did not exist, I can tell you, 30 years ago. So, I mean, your generation can use these new things, or pluck on tree whatever your strategy is, because it is strategic where you put your time, energy, and resources. You can't do everything. Thank you, Chopin. It's great. So any other comments, my friends, and questions? And Anima, see your hand.
Yes, good evening to all. Thank you, Professor Elsa. It's great seeing you again, for today's discussion. And the discussion is very interesting for me because, I think last time one of our speaker, Mr. Roy, have spoken a lot about, our place, especially the state of Tripura, because I think he individually knows about Tripura, so he has spoken a lot. So uh, I know, I think the sisters here, they have a little background, but then just to again highlight, because our territories, we share a very long border, international border with Bangladesh, and our problem is that we have a lot of people coming from the other place, and we, the indigenous, have become minority. And apart from that, what I can see and what I'm connecting with what Shibon have just shared is because the situation there, what I understand from the discussion in Guam is I think they're able to reach at least to the UN level. But when I talk about my place here, about my people here, then, there is this sad history that we're not able to reach even to our government, because what we can see here is that the government grabbing the land in the name of development. And it's like our ancestors land, where probably we have been doing a lot of traditional cultivation in the past. We have been seeing a lot of medicinal herbs in the past, but then now we have to kind of seek permission to access our own forest, our own land. And we don't have the access, we don't have such kind of access. And then also you have mentioned one pointer here, that about resettlement, I guess, where the indigenous are actually in the name of development, they are asked to leave that particular place and move to somewhere else, but the proper arrangement is not done. So even those kind of situation uh, also happen even in our place, so in the past. And that is very sad state. I mean, I'm just trying to understand from Professor Elsa that probably how, or at least in the level of the state, how do we actually voice out or tackle such kind of situation? Because land, right to the land is, I think, very complex. And no, like a common person, for them to understand what is their right and what is not their right is also, I think, it's a tough job for them also. And a small organization like ours, I think even for us, it's quite difficult sometimes to highlight it to the government also, when the government is not very uh, pro, indigenous people. So I don't know if I'm able to get that question to you, Professor Elsa. I'm just in a dilemma that, how as a small group of organization or a small group of NGO, how can we penetrate and explain the rights of our people? Because sometimes even we ourselves are so much kind of confused with all this land rights and the territories and all this, it's kind of difficult even for ourselves to understand, because it's little, I think, it's little bit high level. or I don't know. So I think you can suggest the best way out on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anima. I'm sure you can suggest, but what I can give is like a comparative perspective based on the many stories and much information from different peoples, indigenous peoples, that I have benefited from over the years, and because what I was answering to Shaban before are the international mechanisms. Okay, we talk about the international mechanism, but you go to the international level if you are stuck at the national level. If you are not heard at all at the national level, then you try to push the government to listen to you by going international. And what you find often, and you have found for decades, Anima, is that if you, for example, if you feel that they are closing their ears to you at home, you go to speak about your issue at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues or to the Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Rights, and then the government will listen to you because you spoke at international level, and it has this other push pressure, if you like, and you can also speak in the corridor to the person who represents your government and say, look, our organization has this issue, this is the problem, etc. You give them papers, etc. So the international level, in other words, is a way of stimulating, obliging, pressuring the country to do something at home. This is what you're trying. You're not speaking at the UN just for fun because you don't want to be at home and you with your family. You speak because you want to create change at home. But at the national level, I always wonder and discuss with the friends, and they tell you, what are their strategies? And there are many strategies. It depends on your analysis. You are the best analyst of the situation, of the politics of your regional or central government, whatever that is. You know best, what might create an opening. So people use different methods. One method that has to do with land, since we're talking about land, is the creation of maps, community mapping. Have you heard about it, Anima? Community mapping is when the community, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Anima? Yes? Okay, thank you. So the community, it's a very good, fantastic, exciting thing to do. The community, especially with the elders who remember things that were done with the land or the herbs, for example, you mentioned, that might not be done now exactly. Maybe we don't do them now, but my mother or grandmother did it. So we walk the land to document with GPS, right? To document the map of our land. Here we do the herbs. Here is a sacred site because it has spiritual significance. Here we do. So in other words, indigenous peoples, it's a fantastic thing that has become now more popularized. They do community mapping of their land. So once you do, this is a project, it's a wonderful group activity to do, and it takes time. So once you do that and you create the map of your lands, then you present it to government, for example, and you say, hey, government, this is not empty land, by the way. This is not empty land. I'm using this land, and here is the map of our land, and we have specific signs on the map, herbs, sacred sites, fishing, hunting, whatever, doing some agriculture. And that is a way of telling them it. Then you have to think strategically, what is the next step after the map, after you show them the map. For example, suppose there is a corporation, private corporation, that comes in and wants to do mining. You go to the company and you say, here's our map. This is our land. You can't do it. Free prior informed. We don't give you free prior informed consent for this. No. And another strategy I have seen is when you, at national level, you bring in your friends from the international level, other big organizations, for example, the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, or another one, whatever you are linked with, FIMI, I don't know, whoever is your, the people, your brothers, your sisters, who have a certain name. You can even bring academics. You know that there is an academic network for the Permanent Forum and for EMRIP. There is. You can strategically use it. You can create, that's another strategy, I add the strategy. You can create a conference in your area in collaboration with a local university, and you bring your internationals. You bring a member of the Permanent Forum of EMRIP, whatever, as speakers in addition to you. So you create buzz, you create publicity, awareness. You write some articles in the newspapers. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are tools in your toolkit, based on your analysis of the political, historic, economic situation that you work in, and you will choose the tools. An external cannot use the tools. I don't know. I can tell you these general things that I know from examples. For example, there is a wonderful film. I might send the link to Fimi to share with you. It's called Chumpi and the Waterfall. It is about the Ashuar people in Peru. And what is interesting about it, they are doing community mapping. And you see how they are doing it. And it's a lovely film. And you see how it is combined, Anima. It combines land rights, culture, self-determination, everything. And they're doing the map at the end. And for me, it was a surprise because I was getting into the whole expression. And at the end, I see the map. They were doing mapping. So, yeah, I'm just sharing these examples as a way of saying that we have to be very strategic when we have specific issues. It has to be strategic, and you say you're a small organization. Of course, organizations are limited, in terms of resources, etc. So for this even more reason, you have to be strategic. You say, okay, what am I going to do in the next 3 years? What will be my focus? This, and this. And you cannot do all the rights at once because you are human. You have limitations of resources. But you strategically select, I think. So this is my response, and your question is very, very pertinent. But I think going to the international level, Anima, we also get inspiration from our brothers and sisters, learning from other examples. Nobody will find, you will not necessarily find this in books, but you will, by just being for 2 weeks at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, going to 15 side events in addition, you are going to get so much, it's so enriching because people, struggle for their life. They have wonderful struggles. So we learn. And so what I just shared here are things I have learned from been with people for a long time like that. But the strategic thinking will be yours. Did I answer a little bit?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anima, for raising this. Okay. Do we have another colleague who wants to share or ask? Regina.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I hope my voice can be heard clearly.
Okay.
So first, I would like to share because you mentioned about community mapping. Actually, we've done it since like 90s in here, and it's very effective. We call it participatory mapping. So we
Yes.
only facilitated like a training for the people in the community on how to use GPS and stuff, and then they will do it themselves. But also beside mapping, we also collecting data on a social, cultural, and yeah, social culture and history. So when we give them back the map after it's done, we also give them the book on a history, on a spatial planning, on a like customary law and stuff. So that's what we done in the 90s. But and then luckily, like recently, like our government, like uh, given us the opportunity to register our land. So all the requirements documents are the map and then also the sociocultural document and stuff. So we have been ready with that. So by now we already like register like more than 10 communities, and also we register also the what we call it is the indigenous forest to the Ministry of the Environment, because the government of Indonesia opened that also. So I think it's maybe it's a long time, but it's never like a waste if you try it now for maybe Anima and other sisters to start like documenting everything in your community, because it will be very helpful for our community. And because I think like most of the community also we indigenous people like have that oral traditional thing. So I think it's great to document it because it can be used. For example, we now working on a lobbying the government to teach like the local content. So in the school, in the formal school, so we have the books and stuff. So the teacher in the school can just teach the kids without needing the expert, like the local expert, because and most of them are old and not be able to teach. So I think it's good for the young generation to know their cultures. And then we also struggle because like we've been colonized by Netherlands for 3.5 centuries, and then our second president is quite a dictators, and then he actually erase all the history of the Dayak people, because there is none in Indonesia history that we fought against the colonialism, because he erased that in purpose. And because in Indonesia there are a lot of like tribes. I mean, even we have like a very different language, like 700 languages and stuff. So like Indonesian language is our second language. So and there are like a dominant ethnicity in Indonesia where like the Japanese like live in the Java Islands, but actually our government tried to migrate them all to all the islands, including like Borneo and Sumatra. But that's become a problem for the local people here in Borneo, because when they transmigrated to Borneo, it seems that because they are the majority, like so the people here like in the local community like little by little move to the very far end of the islands, because of them. And also like with regards with oil palm company, because Borneo actually has produced like I think it's the most exported things in Indonesia. So Indonesia like biggest producer of oil palm. And you mentioned before about free prior employment concern. And yes, at first, like our struggle is only because the company didn't ask the local community for the free prior employment consent. But then after we are struggling for a long time, they actually changed their strategies, you know, like they start like getting closer to the local people and make them sell their land like individually, because you know you have like the things got like individual rights and communal rights also, even when we are indigenous people. So one by one, the people in the community selling their land personally to the company. So it's become a struggle, you know, right now. And then usually the company promise them you we will give you a high job in the company and stuff. But after 3 months or so, they will be like fired from the company. And then also the biggest struggle here also because the people in the community start planting their own oil palm. Like it's like a private oil palm, not a company owned oil palm plantation. So uh, we try to educate them like about the environment and stuff, but because like in this era, you know, money is more important than everything, and because like Borneo is a very big island, it's the third largest island in the world, so we still have many remaining forests, but you know, like for a lot in the long run, it's not going to be enough anymore for all the people. And we now we have like a new problem because the government planned to move our capital city to Borneo because Jakarta cannot like it's not good enough anymore for the capital city. So the government going to move that to Borneo Island because it is said that it's safer because there are no earthquake, no flood, and then no tornado and stuff. No, so this is very like safe in a quote ways, but we don't know in the long run. Like we don't want to experience like what the Betawi people in a Java Islands like being removed also from the root because of the capital city. But the people right now is not really realizing it because the new capital like required like 100 of thousands land, and it's the land is belong to the indigenous peoples. However, the Ministry of Defense in Indonesia is the one who had the land in that. Like we don't know how he got that, but according to the law, it's the state own land, so it's something like that. And then because we also have like a lot of criminalization against indigenous peoples. For example, we try to protect our land, we're going to be criminalized because the land is belong to the government and they have the right to cultivate and then stuff. So actually we have one cases when our activists like have like criminalized, and we have to go to the very long court session, and so we won because of judicial review and stuff. But now the land, even if the people is free right now, but the land is still belong to the company. So that is why we seek for the international mechanism, because we've done enough, I think, in the national level on how we we get the land back, because we won the case, but the land is still belong to the company.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina, for this intervention, because you put such a broad, perspective, based also on your amazing struggles, and the Dayak people are famous also for achieving a lot and being very strategic and achieving a lot. So thank you for sharing this, for telling us about the community mapping that you mentioned, and the data collection. That is another very important area. It is not just about land, but it is more broadly about the use of resources. So it is one of the other strategies. Data collection is very important because these days, we have also, in terms of the development agenda internationally, and you hear it also in states, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to have a seminar with Joan Carling about that. And under the SDGs, there is a lot discussed about data collection, which data and which indicators, and Joanne is going to talk to you about it. So doing, from the indigenous perspective, the communities themselves doing their own data collection, and perhaps about this amazing indigenous navigator that exists, and if you don't, Joanne Carling will talk about it. So I pause here because it's not the moment. But data collection, Regina, thank you very much that you mentioned it. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's great that you say that you have managed to register land for more than 10 communities. That is fantastic. And that you devoted a lot of attention to the fact that companies are trying to buy land from individuals. This is unfortunately a common strategy. It happens, the companies try to divide people in order precisely to serve their own interests, and they try to do that, and they break the collective ownership and interest on the land. So that happens. And I appreciated when you mentioned your comment that the state tells you that the land belongs to the state, that you did judicial review, and because they insist on that position, you go to the international level because you have to. So, it looks like you're doing a lot of strategic thinking and pursuing, and thank you for sharing all this. This is very, very good and inspiring for us to hear. You say, Cecilia is asking, is the map on the web or any resources in this that could share? Okay. So it would be great, Regina, if you can share on the map, but I will also share with Cecilia what I have on mapping, okay? So that you may share all this information in FIMI. I see Elizabeth's hand up. Elizabeth.
Hola, buenos días a todas.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's always so impactful to hear all of this, but I'm also kind of tired of hearing all these things, because what I mean by that is that indigenous peoples are always in the resistance. And as women, when we got together in Mexico, we said, we don't want to continue being in the resistance. We need to move to another level with our struggles. And I'd like to comment something that I think is important. I am part of a national network of indigenous lawyers in Mexico, and our need to become lawyers was this issue of law and justice, something that has been consolidated, considered just one thing. These concepts of equality and justice are related to that, and they're based on this idea of a solution for that the solutions are based on the majority groups, such as language. They pick an official language, an official type of education, everything that is being done officially, thinking that with that they're going to achieve equality, and that therefore there's no discrimination and we're all equal and we no longer have to fight for any of this.
So this is very important because it's been important for us to have a dialogue between the two systems. this legal pluralism that we have, but we also talk about political pluralism and a legal pluralism, a juridical pluralism. And I think these pluralisms are not in a state of equality. They're not on a horizontal level with the dominant systems. And so this is one of the largest struggles that we have because according to all these international treaties and all of these instruments, and with all of these mechanisms that exist from the UN system, and our solutions need to be peaceful, and supposedly all our struggles have to be peaceful. But if we're not able to dialogue with an equality of conditions, with true equality, as we were talking about a while ago, with actual access to justice, it's going to be very difficult. The sister that spoke at the beginning explained how in this global state you have all of these big powers. And with indigenous groups, we don't have any groups that are less important than others. And we believe that in all of these commissions and committees, there should be members of indigenous peoples, not just in the indigenous mechanism or the mechanism for indigenous people should we be present. We need to be present in every single mechanism. We can't continue to be underrepresented at the international level. This is very important because if not, we continue to be in the second class position politically instead of being treated as equals. Another important thing that I think is that in 18, we participated in the CERD committee, and we said we were analyzing some of the national codes for the criminal codes in Mexico, for example, because I'm from Mexico. And the analysis that we did of number 420 in the National Criminal Code, we can see that there's still a racial and racially discriminatory aspect to our legal systems, because while the indigenous people systems are recognized, however, we are not allowed to be involved in certain contexts. And they say that indigenous peoples are human rights violators, etc. And there's a racial structure to it because violence is happening all over the country, not just in our communities. And when we talk about land, indigenous women, at least in Mexico, where we have the ejido policy and the agrarian systems that are recognized as two different kinds of systems, ejido being communal land ownership, but women aren't represented in either of those two. There are very few of us that are owners or representatives of ejidos, of these communal lands. Very few women landholders. And so this is another important challenge. Collective struggle is of both men and women. But when these agreements come down to the men who are the owners and the representatives of these communal lands, sometimes it's easier to get through. I think maybe women have a different way of looking at things. we've done some analyses that women have asked our own Indigenous brothers what's the most important things. They say it's important to get food on the table, but women really understand what that means, and that's always relegated to a second level. And so we need a strategy where women have greater representation and advocacy in so many different struggles inside and outside of our communities. So I just wanted to say all of those things. I continue to have questions like how to distinguish between territory and Indigenous jurisdiction. How does that play out with self-determination? And is jurisdiction just geographic? There's so many questions. Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Elizabeth.
And deep reflection that you shared with us about the legal and political pluralism. Of course, this is about that. You mentioned peaceful struggles. You mentioned real equality in accessibility. And you mentioned this very important point that you need to have Indigenous voices in all UN relevant mechanisms, not just the Indigenous related ones. And of course, you know that there is right now this big effort for enhanced participation at the UN precisely on this very point. Indigenous leaders have been pushing that since the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014. And last but not least, really, it's how this big question that you raise, how to bring in Indigenous women's perspectives in your struggles at all levels. And you say, because you have a lot to do and you struggle at many levels. And I will add one more level that we all know. You produce children, we produce children, and that's a very important struggle as well to create, the context of a new life in our family, in our community. So, yeah, I am very inspired, Elizabeth, by your deep involvement with these concepts and these struggles. And I really hope to meet you personally one of these days before too long, Elizabeth. Okay? At the Permanent Forum, somewhere, or me in Mexico. We'll see. Thank you, dear.
Aquí le esperamos.
We will hope to see you here.
So we have Maria. Yeah, Maria is sending her big message. She says, about the issues that we face. Despite the challenges they face while fighting for their rights, it's important we continue training and building capacity of our Indigenous communities regarding land rights, as well as creating awareness. For instance, we help the communities to identify their natural resources by developing biocultural protocol, which is very important since they depend on land for their livelihoods. Most of our communities are patriarchal in nature, which also deny our Indigenous women access to land, affecting their economic status, which also brings aspect of Indigenous inequality, of gender inequality. Yes, indeed, it is also well known. I just wanted to add one more thing that I'm reminded by you having raised all this, my dear sisters, that many Indigenous peoples have created their own protocols for free, prior, and informed consent. I think Chief Devashish Roy mentioned it, I think. I'm not sure, but just for you to know, and for those of us that are involved in these, in the struggles, and also have some legal training, it's good to help out, you know. And what I have found interesting is that although these are protocols that indigenous peoples themselves have created, not the state, just the indigenous, particular indigenous people have created for their own community. I have heard a lot about companies, for example, corporations that follow this protocol. This is very interesting, you know, because it has to do with land and with everything, but especially with land. So you combine, you know, self-determination with land, because free, prior, informed consent is a major expression of self-determination. So it is very good to know that there are these many examples, and that the externals, like for example corporations, want to follow them so as to have a smooth work, you know, in what they want to do. So my dear friends, I look at the clock now, and may I ask that may I ask Hortensia if she allows us to take a 2-minute break before we go to the cultural rights aspect, so that we can just take a breath, drink water, and in 2 minutes we come back to continue on cultural rights. Can we do that, Hortensia?
Sí, está bien, profesora. 2 minutos entonces para que
Sure,
todas
that's great. A 2-minute break then, so that we can move from our chairs and come back. And we'll come back with some more questions in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Gracias por el descanso, profesora.
Thank you for the rest, Professor. So we're back again and ready to continue.
So we are now going to go into cultural rights, and I'm going to share my screen and make a presentation, dear friends, and then we continue our discussion interventions on your side. Please note down your your wonderful comments, not to forget them. Right. Okay. So in my introduction, dear friends, I will say something that might sound a little bit like a surprise, that cultural rights are the most neglected category of human rights since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So we say we have various categories of human rights, right? We have economic, social, cultural rights, civil, political rights. So out of these 5 categories, cultural rights are most neglected. So the first question I want to ask is, why this neglect? So the first answer is that there is a challenge in the definition of culture, which is a very broad concept and constantly changing, versus a requirement to be very specific on how we formulate rights, human rights. And why do we need specificity? Because we need to create corresponding obligations on the part of the state, right? This is the legal approach that we have to human rights. So a lot of people who have been lawyers, who have been dealing with human rights, culture is for them something that they cannot deal with a lot, they don't know how to capture it in order to create specificity of requirements, of obligations for states. So the problem of definition of culture, we see that UNESCO, I put this definition because I find it interesting in the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity of UNESCO. It's a good one. It says culture is the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of a society or a social group, which encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. Quite broad, right? B, in its very essence, it's a social phenomenon resulting from individuals joining and cooperating in creative activities. It's not limited to access to works of art and to human rights, but it is at one and the same time the acquisition of knowledge, the demand for a way of life and need to communicate, unquote. And later on, in 2009, when the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights finally, after decades, decided to issue a general recommendation on the right to participate in cultural life, it said the following about the definition. It said, culture is a broad, inclusive concept encompassing all manifestations of human existence. The expression cultural life is an explicit reference to culture as a living process, historical, dynamic, and evolving, with a past and a present and a future. But you see, my dear friends, even though we have these definitions, how challenging it is, right? To make this, to break it down into concrete obligations for states. And going back, to the reasons of the neglect, we see that another reason is the fact that human rights experts, advocates, they were a bit afraid that cultural rights would wake up the possibility of undermining the universality of human rights. It means we want human rights to be universal. We don't want people to say, oh, but in my culture, I don't like it to apply, So this is like a fear, that human rights advocates have had. So they didn't touch culture. The third reason for neglect is that for many, cultural rights are thought to be a luxury, something that we seek after we ensure our other basic rights. And then for others, cultural rights are economic things, are things to sell. They don't see necessarily the moral aspects and therefore the human rights aspects of cultural rights. And lastly, as a reason for the neglect, it comes from states, right? For governments, cultural rights have raised the scary specter of group rights, of minority rights, that the state is very defensive about and feels threatened from. So we go now to what is, let me do something here, excuse me 1 second. What we will deal with is the content of cultural rights. What does that mean, actually, to go closer to this, to demystify, to open that door a little bit, and also to talk about the complementarity between cultural rights and other rights, and also just to think a little bit about language rights that are cultural rights that have special significance for us, and also protection of traditional knowledge. If we have time, we can deal separately with a little PowerPoint, but not necessarily. It will depend whether we have time. So I put up here, Article 27 of the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what does that say? I have quoted it here. It says, everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of their community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And the second paragraph says, everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. Those days they were not saying he or she, 1948, right? Okay, so what do we see here? We need to comment on the word the, right? You see the cultural life of the community. So obviously, in the mind of some drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was clear that under this article, secretly, if you like, was actually the topic was protection of minorities. And that we needed in that article to protect from discrimination and also from forced assimilation, and in particular to protect ethnicity and language. So it was known politically among the states that were negotiating this article. And in the original draft of this article, there was also an article, a text that was saying that we need to protect the right of persons belonging to ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities to establish and maintain schools and cultural and religious institutions, and to use their own language in the press, in public assembly, and before the courts and other authorities of the state. So there were some texts there that people, especially from the Secretariat, but some states too, put in there. But these texts were not included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so this word of, oops, sorry for that, this word of the, in the cultural life of the community, it's a kind of way of saying there is one cultural life and one community, and it does not recognize the language, does not recognize that, well, we have a plurality here, in our world, in every country, in fact, in terms of cultures and communities. So what I also wanted to mention, and this is very revealing for me when I did this research, at the same time as the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was the drafting of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And there was a proposal to put some text that would read as follows. In this convention, genocide also means any deliberate act committed with the intent to destroy the language, religion, or culture of a national, racial, or religious group on grounds of national or racial origin, such as prohibiting the use of the language of the group in daily intercourse or in schools or in printing and circulation of publications. 2, destroying or preventing the use of libraries, museums, schools, historical monuments, places of worship, or other cultural institutions and objects of the groups. So in other words, I have bolded the words that are buzzwords for culture, right? So you saw that in the original actually concept of the crime of genocide, it was not just physical, but also cultural genocide in the mind of some original drafters. However, these words, these phrases were not accepted either in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in the Anti-Genocide Convention that were negotiated at the same time. So this is very revealing. And now we come, and then came a long silence, of states and of human rights mechanisms as well for a very long time. And we come to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2007, which is the boldest recognition in international law of cultural rights. And at least 17 of about cultural rights. In fact, one can find the cultural rights angle in each article. And I have mentioned here, I have put all the articles that are related to cultural rights, and I have bolded Articles 7 and 8 because they actually touch on genocide. And it is very revealing also of our human political history that since 1948, my friends, our declaration is the first and only instrument, human rights instrument, declaration in this case, that mentions genocide. No others do. So the declaration, our declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, does not contain any new cultural human rights, but it restates in one systematic text human rights that are contained in treaties that have been created before, in the texts and the interpretation of those treaties that we have through the work of human rights bodies and through the advocacy of the people who struggle in their social struggles. And I want to mention in particular Article 27 of the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that and recognizes the rights of persons belonging to ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities in community with the other members of their group to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, and to use their own language. And indigenous peoples have used this article, my friends, of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and they have created rich case law in their favor in the monitoring of the covenant, of this covenant. And there is very rich case law in favor of indigenous peoples' cultural rights. The Convention also on the Rights of the Child of 1989, it recognizes that in states where ethnic, religious, linguistic minorities or persons of indigenous origin exist, a child belonging to such a minority or who is indigenous shall not be denied the right in community with other members of his or her group to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, or to use his or her own language. And you see, I am proving to you by showing you this that there are traces of cultural rights, at least in the language of some other treaties before our declaration. So in addition to the
Además,
articles that I mentioned to you in our declaration, there is another one that is very important. It's about participation and cultural autonomy of indigenous peoples, of course, but also education of the broader society about the cultures of minorities and indigenous peoples. This is very important because human rights bodies have understood that in order to create a just society where equality will prevail, you need to inform the whole society, make it aware, right, of the various issues that we have in our societies and the plurality of our societies. So informing, educating society at large about minority cultures or indigenous cultures is very important. And here we come to an issue that is sensitive. I'm sure we've heard it as women and as human rights advocates. So the borders, the question is between the borders between individual and group rights, and sometimes we can phrase it, I put it like in quotation marks, not every right, not every custom, in other words, is a human right. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples does address this in Article 34 and 46. It says, in 34, it says, Indigenous peoples have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, traditions, procedures, and practices. And in case where they exist, their juridical systems or customs in accordance with internationally recognized human rights standards. What does this mean? It means that we have a human rights, framework that has been created by international human rights norms. And of course, whatever actions are taking place by, indigenous peoples who have their clear the systems, of governance and legal systems, traditions, and so on, they have to take place in accordance with internationally recognized human rights standards. And I want to say this because, again, I want to demystify, because I was there during the negotiations. Indigenous leaders were very aware of this context, and they were very, how can I say, cool, comfortable, saying, yes, of course, there may be some customs, some habits that we have that might not be according to international human rights norms, and well, we'll need to take care of that. And that happens actually in all societies. It doesn't happen, obviously, just in indigenous societies. And again, you find this in Article 40 and 46. Again, for example, in 40, it says, such decision of our declaration, right? Such decision shall give due consideration to customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems of indigenous peoples and to international human rights. So there is, because the Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples is a human rights instrument. So of course it was formulated within the broader, context of human rights. And it also, I also refer to Article 46, paragraph 2, which says, in the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. Okay, it's a common thing. Actually, you find this, in almost this kind of statement in almost all human rights instruments. You might find it in the preamble or in an article. And Article 46 also says, The provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. So you can see, in other words, after 25 years of careful negotiations and drafting, how this question has, at least in the language of our declaration, has been addressed. Okay, so now I would like to refer to something that, what are the obligations of the state? The obligations of the state in the field of human rights, I don't know, I don't remember again whether Chief Devashish mentioned, we say it in human rights theory and practice, they are threefold. They have to respect, protect, fulfill, remedy. Respect means that the state and its agents, whoever they are, civil servants, the police, the army, whatever, they have to respect human rights of people. Protect is very important because it means that the state must protect the right to participate in cultural life from infringement by third parties, by individuals, by corporations, or other groups. Fulfill is about positive action and use of resources by the state. For example, when it comes to indigenous languages in schools, you have to take specific actions, right? And devote specific resources, specific actions and resources. And remedy is when these rights are violated by the agents of the state or by third parties, the state must have ways, mechanisms to remedy these violations. In other words, take care of the victims, the survivors of these violations. I wanted to add that thanks to the wonderful work of some treaty bodies, in particular the Human Rights Committee under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we have, as part of cultural rights, the right of indigenous peoples to continue certain economic activities linked to the traditional use of land and natural resources, such as hunting and fishing. So I wanted to stress, and you see immediately here, of course, the complementarity of human rights. Of course, it's land rights and cultural rights and economic rights, all linked together. And of course, states have to respect indigenous people's right to pursue their own cultural development through their own institutions as well. And I want to move towards the visionary aspect of that I feel that cultural rights provide to us, because I feel, based on my listening to indigenous peoples over the years, that attention to cultural rights can have real and practical effects. It can help us strengthen public policies for the respect of the identity of indigenous peoples, and also to build intercultural relations. A very fundamental condition for that is genuine participation of indigenous peoples. In other words, a state that wants to take measures, that will have implications for indigenous people's cultural rights, has to be in real dialogue with the indigenous peoples concerned, so that the measures the state will take will be meaningful. And also, I want to stress here that cultural rights, although they have tremendous symbolic significance, they also can have material effects, and resource and can help to a certain resources transfer. For example, I found it very interesting that in some truth and reconciliation commissions, some conclusions stressed the importance of helping indigenous language revitalization and giving, of course, resources for that. And this is, for example, part of the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that I found very interesting. In other words, the respect for Indigenous peoples' visions of well-being and development with culture and identity, because Indigenous people say we want development with culture and identity. And for this, we need support for cultural strengthening projects. We don't see enough support for that. It's interesting to me that we don't see it. It's not, yes, for education related more, but when Indigenous people say, yes, we want to create a museum, we want to revive our traditional knowledge on this or that, you don't see enough financial assistance for such projects. And I feel also, and I want to say that what in 1948 the world failed to recognize adequately cultural rights in the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the text of the Anti-Genocide Convention. But I feel that in 2007, in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we see the beginning of a new wave, in the thinking of the world regarding culture and cultural rights. So in conclusion, I want to say that through the respect and protection of Indigenous people's cultural rights, we can build bridges among Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, because when people know about each other's culture and share them, which people have done through time immemorial, people tend to be in dialogue and be more friendly and constructive to each other. And in this way, we can build more inclusive and truly pluricultural societies and states. So this is my conclusion from my brief presentation on this huge topic of cultural rights. And I would very much like to open our discussion here, because I am sure you have lots to say. When I speak to the female women group and to Indigenous group friends, it is such a surprise for any of us, to think that there was such neglect. That's why I start by trying to understand why the neglect for cultural rights. This is the beginning. And then we come, to 2007, and we see in the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights such a rich, actually the richest international human rights document we have in terms of recognition of cultural rights. So it is interesting for us to think, how our humanity has progressed over time and what Indigenous people struggles have contributed to that. Because it is because of these struggles that we have these cultural rights boldly recognized in the Declaration. I stop now, and I would like to hear your thoughts, questions, personal examples, and from your communities. January, you have the floor.
Buenos días, profe Elsa. Muchísimas gracias por compartir
Good
con
morning,
nosotros.
Professor Elsa. Thank you so much for sharing with us your valuable experience and knowledge, which every Friday we're here listening to you. And I'm so thankful for being here and having this opportunity from FEMI listening to you. As part of the pluriculturality in Nicaragua and the Caribbean coast, Northern Caribbean coast, there are a lot of ethnicities, such as the Creole, Mayanas, Caribeans. They live on the southern part of the Caribbean coast, and us, mosquitoes. We have had cultural confrontation, especially with the mosquito people and the Maya people. They're a little bit more reserved and isolated. So confrontations have taken place. But I would say that throughout all of this path that we've walked on human rights, we are becoming more united to defend our lands. And as we've said before, with as this subject has been presented, my great grandmother, rest in peace, said, "My patrimony, the most important patrimony I can pass to you is the land, because on this land are the paths walked by your ancestors, the fruits and the plants that they placed so that you can get your food, your nurturing, and everything that you need from nature." So I wanted to mention that thing, that issue about digamos, opposing feelings, and also highlight that we need the different ethnicities to unite, because as we always say, united, we become stronger. Anywhere we go to talk about indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights, we need to do it together. One single ethnicity may do a little bit of advocacy, but not much more. But united, we will be much stronger, we'll do much more. So thank you, Professor Elsa, for the very valuable information that you're sharing with us.
For these inspiring words, and bringing also your grandmother to us, because this is also part of culture and also part of women's culture. I think that having these links amongst women across generations is very precious. I find it very precious also as a grandmother that I am now. And you said what your grandmother told you about they are not mechanical words. They are words with a lot of content, right? A lot of spirit, a lot of, inspiration, of love, And I also think what you said about defending the land united together. This is such an important point. You can say that perhaps the fact that indigenous peoples have such a strong culture of the community might also be helpful. And I wanted to say, you inspired me to remember that at the international level, at the UN, imagine the variety, the diversity of indigenous people coming, right? Huge diversity. And of course, states that did not want progress to be made, for example, on the declaration, they were trying to divide more the indigenous people, right? They were trying to say to the mosquitoes, you are this, but to the Mayas, you are other, and to the people, the Maasai, from Africa, you are something else. And what is amazing, and we really have to historically speak more about that and understand it, the miracle It's not a miracle. It's human will. It's not a miracle. How indigenous peoples representing all this variety and diversity at international level, they united. They united and they came up with ideas with common positions most of the time on the declaration in order to be stronger. Because as you said, if we are united, we're stronger. So that's what they did. And I really admired that because it's normal to have different opinions. Of course, we have different opinions, of course. But you know also that the states try to divide us, so we don't make progress. But despite that, I find it a historic, amazing victory, of human will and human vision, because the leaders, the indigenous leaders, understood the importance of this unity. And if you come, Johnnery, if you are able to come to the permanent forum, you will see, for example, the tremendous work that is done for people before to organize this. So all this, there is debate among people, of course, but there are caucuses. There is the women get together, or the Latin Americans get together. There are organizational meetings where the various positions are debated, and then they come into an agreement, So there is unity, and there is power to that. So thank you for raising this very important point. It matters nationally, Johnnery, and internationally in the struggles. It matters a lot. Thank you. And indigenous peoples have created a family. A family. So now we are broader family with you, Johnnery. Anima, I see your hand.
Thank you, Professor. It's me again. Yes. Professor Elsa, I was very eagerly waiting for this topic, actually, cultural rights, because somehow I think the cultural rights also is, linked to the religious rights of our indigenous people. And whenever we talk about religion, it's a very, I think, sensitive, very controversial, very emotional at the same time, especially for indigenous. So I remember because I think the second class of uh, one of the speaker, Maria, she kind of touched me because at that point of time also I spoke about, the religious changes that the indigenous have come a long way, and we talk about the transition that can happen in one's life. uh, it's a very sensitive thing, but I just want to um, take this freedom because this is a women's forum, and probably I can speak very openly over here. So, over here, even in our state, because we have our own religion, and religion has to do with culture. Because whenever we practice any kind of culture, that is to do something with the way we pray, with the way whom we worship, with the way how we actually wear our clothes, with the way what we eat, and what we offer. So it's kind of linked. So now what I can see is that uh, because of all these changes, in fact, I mean, because of assimilation, I should say, because there are different communities in our state, so much of assimilation that the culture is getting mixed. The way we practice is getting mixed, and of course religion is also being imposed. A different religion, a foreign religion, is being imposed, and I think many of us have accepted the imposed religion. The western culture is more superior, that's how we take it. So my question is, Professor, I just want to know that even in UN level, if this kind of realization or this kind of talks have been there, and if it's something that probably now that the UN is taking up more, about the culture and the religious rights, or if it was there in the past as well, because we talk about UN mechanisms, and it's I think it's quite some time now, so if we have realized at that point of time, and our elders who have been taking these issues, I just want to know, in terms of in that international platform, how do the how people look at this, or we just want to be, because we don't talk too much openly about religion, because as you know that it's very sensitive issue. So I just want to get to hear something from you. uh, yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anima. This is really a very good question and topic for discussion. I want to say that the efforts to create an international human rights instrument on um, uh, fighting religious intolerance was a different path, completely different path, distinct in the international fora. In other words, the civil society people the NGOs, that pushed for that, and we now have a declaration against religious intolerance, were different people. They did not link much with culture. It was very different. Why was it different? I will now interpret, because you put me on the spot, so I have to answer you something. I think it's because the organized major religions of the world, have very strong interests to keep their power and safeguard it. So they didn't want to say what you said about how culture and religion is linked, and about or mixed or whatever. They didn't want that. And who are strong groups there? I would say in terms of the religious groups, you have some Christian groups that are strong. You have Muslim groups that are strong. In terms of religious groups, these are the strong groups that have political involvement at this international UN level. Personally, because I have done research on cultural rights, I see the tremendous link between culture and religion, because whatever religion you take, if it is even one of the big known religions, right, so-called known religions, they are practiced differently because the cultures are integrated in them, but I want to say something about spirituality, because the indigenous peoples, when we were discussing for decades the declaration, they were stressing at various moments that they were saying that, complaining that our religions are not recognized by states. They were saying they are just pushed away, as if they're not religions. So they're saying we have so many spiritual practices, and then they were explaining. So for this reason, the word spirituality appears in our declaration. If you do a rereading of it, you will see that the word spirituality appears, including, of course, the spiritual relation to lands. And it is, again, the only international instrument that mentions spirituality. And this was indigenous leaders' own way of wanting to put in a declaration the broadest possible sense. It might not be religion according to your to the mainstream, whatever, to the common understanding of what religion is. But for us, these are very precious, important, religious, spiritual, broader. It captures many, many systems of touching on the metaphysical. Was that a sensitive issue during the debates on our declaration? I don't think that it was, because states did not react much about it. They did not protest it, They did not protest the word spirituality. They didn't protest the inclusion the term sacred sites in our declaration. No, it did not appear. Now, you mentioned, Anima, that it's a sensitive issue. It is a sensitive issue also among indigenous peoples, in the sense that several, many indigenous people profess just these other, as you call them, imposed religions, other religions, non-indigenous, also they're indigenous, combination of the two. And it's very much a personal question of freedom of conscience, So in that sense, it is a sensitive issue also to discuss among indigenous peoples. However, I am very glad that indigenous peoples did manage to do adequate critique of some of the Vatican, the doctrine of discovery that I told you this morning, that they struggle, and finally it was repudiated yesterday by the Vatican. So yeah, I think as a result of this sensitivity, it took so long, because indigenous peoples wanted that in 1992, when it was the 500 years, 1992. They wanted that repudiation, but they got it into 2023. Okay. Stop. Maria.
Thank you very much for the great presentation concerning the cultural rights. I just want to add on my experience working with the community. For instance, in the community, most of the young generation experience challenge when coming to speaking their local language. And I think this is because of formal education. But we are trying to, as we work with the community, we are trying to encourage intergenerational dialogue between the young generation and the elders. And also we do documentation of the traditional knowledge and the culture, so that the generation can also learn from the documentation. And also the population of the old generation is becoming fewer. So I think it is important to continue to encourage them with intergenerational dialogue and also documentation, since they are the one with much knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for raising this important thing of documentation of traditional knowledge and the intergenerational aspect. I also feel that this is crucial, and I am glad to hear that several indigenous communities do that, and they do that in ways also of protecting. They don't publish it necessarily, but protect it. I have a presentation on traditional knowledge. I don't know, we will see whether we have more discussion here and whether we have time. But also the language issue that you mentioned, and you saw in my presentation that references to language protection were deleted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Anti-Genocide Convention, because states understand that languages matter a lot in maintaining a strong identity among people. And so I wanted to say, in that historic context that I gave you, right? You see how important, what a victory it was when, thanks to the amazing advocacy of Indigenous peoples, of course, supported by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, etc., in 2019, we had the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And now, since 2022, since last year, we started an International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This is so important if we put it, in historical perspective, because languages do not disappear because they are like the autumn leaves that fall down. They disappear because there are practices, policies of states that actually persecute languages explicitly, or through discrimination, people are discouraged from speaking them, and parents are also discouraged from passing them on to children. It's also common. So I want to celebrate, Maria, to celebrate really your intervention reminded me of this power of the Indigenous advocacy, to break this resistance of decades on the part of states. States have wanted to suppress languages from being spoken. So they allow, for example, this has happened, what I'm going to say has happened in Russia and also in my country, Greece. So they will allow, let's say, communities, minority communities, to have festivals and wear clothes and dance their songs, dance their dances by playing the music, but they will not allow them to sing the words of the song. I'm just giving you these examples, This is to show you the toughness on the part of states, So I just wanted to share that, and for us to be able to appreciate these victories of Indigenous peoples at the policy level, and the fact that we now have the Decade of Indigenous Languages, and a lot of good work will be done, sharing of good experiences and so on. So, yeah. Is there any other? And sisters, you can also not just speak to me, but you can ask another colleague of yours.
Professor Elsa?
Yes, Winnie.
Yeah, I just wanted to share also about what's happening with us in Sudan right now. I
Okay.
think what happens is, well, what's happening, especially with us, the Nuba people, is that our languages have been and our cultures have been made to be barbaric and backward. And so many people don't want to be associated with barbarism or backwardness or uncivilized practices, hence abandoning their languages and their practices and taking up the Arabic language and practice. But also, it's like it's been institutionalized so that if you don't know Arabic, then you're not employable, or you're not able to get certain positions in not just even the government, but even in the community level. You're not able to get leadership positions if you're not fluent in Arabic. In many instances, if you're not Muslim, then it even discriminates you further. So you're not able to get jobs. You're not able to be in a certain level at government if you're not if you've not completely abandoned, your traditional religious practices. And so I think because we're in a world where economic stability or social stability has been elevated in a way that everyone is focused on how can I be more financially stable and I'll do anything it takes to be able to be stable. And so it has led not just the older generation, but especially now the younger generation to very cheaply and quickly abandon their roots, their culture, their language, where there is no interest anymore because according to them, being now in my example would be being Nuba means being backwards, means being uncivilized, means not having opportunities to advance, if it's in education or employment, or if it's getting government positions or stuff like that. So they've used our livelihoods as a weapon to ensure that there's cultural and language eradication of indigenous peoples' languages and cultures. So it's a difficult place to be in because, I mean, if someone tells you, will you eat or will you speak your language? You know, it's a very difficult decision to make. And naturally, you'd pick to eat and not speak your language. So I think that's the challenge that not I imagine it's not just for us. Many indigenous peoples are facing the same challenges. Yeah, so it's just so again, I'm just wondering how then do we use the tools that we have, you know, in if it's in the declaration or in other text that elevates our cultures and our languages, how are we able to use those to educate or to empower our communities and our youth to be able to understand the importance of our languages and our cultures, and especially taking advantage of now this decade of indigenous languages. How do we use that this decade to also elevate our own languages? So those are just some of the thoughts that I usually have when thinking about my own language and my own culture that's at risk of being lost at present time. Yeah.
Thank you, Winnie. This is a very deep reflection and representing a deep problem that, as you say, it's not just about your people, but it's experienced by many people. And you say, will you eat or speak your language, kind of question, you know? And I want to mention one other example that impressed me, that after when in Guatemala they were putting together, you know, the peace accords so that they would finish with their strife, etc. There were some efforts to involve indigenous peoples in education decisions, and it regarding their children's education and language specifically. And there were cases that I had read where the parents, for reasons you mentioned, preferred for the kids to learn Spanish at school because they said, we want them to be able to find a job afterwards, and a good job. You know, this kind of thing that you were reflecting here. And that was interesting. But I will also mention something I have learned from Mr. Ole Henrik Maga, who was, you know, the first chairman of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, you know, a Sami leader, and actually a professor of linguistics. And he said, in many words. He had a passion about this, because he said that at age 9 or 10, he said he was made to feel that he was stupid or retarded. He couldn't think that, and the reason was that, of course, he spoke Sami and he was only taught in Norwegian, at the school, and he was not doing good in math or something. And his answer to this question that you mentioned is that he said his position is, and he's an advocate for that. He says, we indigenous peoples have to have the following goals: to know our language very well, to know the majority language of where we live, and to know English so we can function in the international forum. So that's what he pointed out. I wanted to say something else that has come out very clearly from our unique gatherings. We have done 2 under the Permanent Forum on Indigenous languages, the only ones that are global. What has come out very clearly is that for a language to survive and develop further, a fundamental condition is not just money and experts that come to help, but it is what you touched on, Winnie. It is the will of the community. In other words, you need to have the community really wanting to keep the language, to preserve it and to develop it. So how do you create that will so it does not weaken because of the reasons you discussed? And we know, and there are also these discriminations that are indirect, not just in words, as calling a word backward, a language backward or uncivilized. And so that is part of our advocacy at community level, of the importance of language, of the beauty of language, of what we preserve. It's not just the words, all the knowledge, the philosophy, the community. We exist as a community in different ways, and the intergenerational aspect of that. So I wanted to share that the will of the community is crucial. And lastly, Winnie, because you mentioned how the Nuba language is viewed as backward or uncivilized or something. This is not just for the Nuba. It is being used, and it has been used. I know also, for example, in some Asian countries, and for this reason, some of the struggles, the political struggles of the indigenous peoples, were to delete this word uncivilized or backward from laws or constitutions, for that matter, because that matters. Last, it's like something I recently experienced. There was a conference on languages in 2018 in China. I was there. It was an international conference. And there were some Chinese people who came and said, in our subways, you have posters that say, speak, not Chinese, what is the Mandarin, yeah. Speak Mandarin, be civilized. How can we take this? This does not help us, cultivate our threatened languages. It means that if we don't speak Mandarin, we are uncivilized. So it's the same concept there, Winnie, So it means that we have to fight that at policy level in our advocacy. The use of demeaning, derogatory words about our languages or our cultures. This is one way of discrimination and oppression, for that matter.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Elsa. That's enlightening. And I think these are just reflections that continue to sit with many of us when we think about our languages and our cultures. So we still have a few more minutes. So Medalit has her hand up.
Sí, sí, hermanas, muy buenas.
Yes, sisters, good morning and good evening to everyone. Good afternoon. I just wanted to add on to something that our sister Winnie just said in her conversation with the professor. Our mother tongue here in Puna has had a similar experience. Often parents don't want their children to speak Aymara, for example, here, because they will have more access to work and perhaps more access to education, and they'll be able to get important positions if they speak Spanish instead. And so what happens is that often, and I've seen this in my own family, the children leave their traditional villages and go to the city for a better future, and they go to schools there, but they're discriminated against a lot, even by other children who are from the cities. And so almost by force, they have to learn Spanish so they don't feel like they're discriminated against. And often those of us who speak our mother tongue have difficulties. And they call it, they use a word saying moteroso, which means you can't speak Spanish very well. And so that word gets used a lot against our indigenous children. And so that kind of discrimination and racism is something that we're dealing with. And this has been a really significant factor because our own parents have decided that it's better for their children not to speak their language. And as the sister was saying, that they want their children to get into other educational opportunities to become professionals, and they don't want their children to be discriminated against. So I was talking to my parents also about why we weren't taught the maternal language, that we weren't taught Aymara, which this should have been the first language we learned. But they told us that they had also experienced that kind of discrimination. And they said, no, we don't want you to suffer. And that's why we wanted you to speak correct Spanish. And so now, as we are young people on this path of reevaluating our culture and our cultural identity, we say this is a huge challenge. And we have to have a goal of learning our language of Aymara because we don't speak it well. We do understand it, however. And quite a few of our generation are like that, that we understand it, but we don't speak it. And that's a big challenge that each of us has. And a challenge as we become parents, so that we will learn Aymara and speak it in our homes. Also, there's, hello? Just lost the sound. Interpreter apologizes. Cannot hear Medalit at this moment. We can't hear you, Medali. Medali, dear Medali, we cannot hear you.
I think maybe she may have lost her connection or something.
Maybe.
So maybe Professor Elsa, you can respond to anything that you have had,
Oh yeah,
and before we conclude.
yes, of course. I am sorry that if Medalit cannot hear because she, yeah, this was a very important story she was telling. But I wanted to say to agree 100% with her statement that said that young people like her now want to strengthen the language, and I see that around the world, and that's why perhaps we have now an international decade of the world's indigenous languages. And there are also examples I wanted to mention to Meredith and to everybody where parents who did not speak the indigenous language to their kids now they go and take classes together with the kids, you know, to learn and relearn the language in a good way, you know, without mistakes, as Meredith says. So there is an excitement right now about preserving and revitalizing our languages, you know, which is very, very good, very hopeful, I find, especially in a time of internet, of our internet lives. So thank you, Winnie, and I think maybe it is up to you to round up.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Professor. I also want to mention that we're doing the same in our community, language revitalization. So we've been doing it for almost 4 years now, where the older generation and the young ones are learning the language together. So it's a very exciting journey that we are on. So thank you so much again for this session and for sharing not just the knowledge, but for also the sisters who've shared their experiences with the different, you know, if it's in culture, in the cultural things. So it's, yeah, I think it's exciting, and I wish all of us the best. That's the time that we've had today. We'll have Professor Elsa back with us again in about 2 weeks. So again, if there's any questions or comments that you want to share, please share them with us, and then we'll forward them to her, and then we'll be able to perhaps have a few moments to respond to them when she's back in about 2 weeks. So thank you again, Professor, and thank you, sisters. We look forward to seeing you again on Monday for our session on Monday. Don't forget, we have a session on Monday. Have a good weekend. Take care, everyone, and see you soon.
Take care, everybody. Bye bye.